Have you ever had a job where everything felt like a perfectly oiled but maybe a little soul-crushing machine? Or, on the flip side, maybe you've worked somewhere that was more like a big, chaotic, but super creative family. You know, the difference between those places often comes down to the management theories running the show behind the scenes. So today, we're going to trace the wild evolution of these big ideas all the way from the first factories to the complex global companies we have now. Let's dive in.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to drop into what's called the management jungle to see how all this chaos got started. Then we'll check out the first major attempt to bring order to that chaos, which was all about building organizations like perfect machines. After that, we'll see a total revolution that put people back in the picture. Then we'll zoom out and look at the whole system, and finally, we'll land on the modern idea that maybe, just maybe, the best answer depends.
So this is where our story kicks off. To really get a grip on management today, you have to rewind to the Industrial Revolution. I mean, this was a time of massive, world-changing upheaval. It created problems nobody had ever seen before, which led to this wild, overgrown jungle of competing ideas about the best way to run things.
And that name, the management theory jungle, it's not mine. It actually comes from a thinker named Harold Kuntz. He looked at the absolute mess of ideas floating around and gave it the perfect name. See, as the industrial age exploded, you suddenly had these huge factories, labor unions, brand new markets, and everyone had a different theory on how to manage it all. A lot of those theories completely contradicted each other. It was confusing, it was dense, it was a jungle. And today, we're going to chart a path right through it. Okay, so this leads us to the very first attempt to clear a path through that jungle, what we call the classical approach. This is really the oldest formal school of management thought, and it was born out of a desperate need for some kind of efficiency and structure in these gigantic new industrial organizations.
The central idea here is actually pretty simple, but it was incredibly powerful. Think of an organization not as a group of people, but as a machine. Right? If you can design the structure perfectly, if every single gear and lever has a clearly defined function, and if it's all controlled from a central point, then you should get maximum efficiency. These early theorists were laser-focused on the formal structure, the anatomy of the organization. And this machine-like view really had three main architects. First up, you've got F.W. Taylor and his scientific management. This guy was obsessed, and I mean obsessed, with finding the one single best way to do any given task on the factory floor. Then you had Henri Fayol, who looked at it from the top down with his administrative management, focusing on the big principles that the executives should follow. And finally, Max Weber gave us the blueprint for the machine itself, bureaucracy, a rational, impersonal structure built on super clear rules and, importantly, merit. So what did it actually feel like to work inside this classical machine? Well, first off, the organizational chart was basically the Bible. It dictated the rigid chain of command. Your job was broken down into the smallest possible, most specialized task, so you did one thing over and over again. And the people doing that work? They were viewed as economic men. Basically, the assumption was that you were only there for a paycheck, and that's the only thing that motivated you. All the real authority was centralized way up at the top, making sure the machine's interests always came first. And right here, this quote, this gets to the single biggest blind spot of the entire classical approach. In their absolute quest for mechanical perfection, they kind of forgot about the people running the machine. They were so focused on the formal structure that they completely ignored the human element, personalities, informal friendships, office politics, conflicts. They basically treated people like any other resource, like a lump of coal for the furnace or a steel beam for the frame, an organization without people. Well, that massive oversight, that organization without people idea, it set the stage for a total revolution in management. The neoclassical or human relations approach wasn't just some small update. It was a full-on rebellion against that cold mechanical worldview. It was finally time to admit that there was a ghost in the machine, the human being. But here's the crazy part. This huge shift in thinking, it didn't come from some philosopher in an armchair. Nope. It was born from a series of real-world experiments that set out to prove the old way of thinking was right, but they ended up accidentally discovering something completely different and way more important. So get ready for the legendary Hawthorne experiments. Okay, so let's walk through this because it's fascinating. It all started with a simple experiment about lighting. Researchers figured, hey, better light, more productivity, right? But they were totally baffled when productivity shot up, whether they made the lights brighter or dimmer. Weird. Next, in the relay assembly room, they took a small group of women, gave them better breaks, shorter hours, and productivity soared. But here's the kicker. When they took all those perks away, productivity stayed high. Then, in the bank wiring room, they found that the informal social group, the workers' own little clique, had way more say over how much work got done than any official company incentive. And finally, after thousands of interviews, they stumbled upon the simplest truth of all: workers' attitudes and morale were key. Just listening to them, showing them they mattered, that had a huge impact. So the groundbreaking, world-changing takeaway from all these Hawthorne studies was this: an organization is a social system, not just a technical or mechanical one. The most important thing isn't the org chart or the pay plan, it's the human factor. The social and psychological needs of the people doing the work have a direct, massive impact on performance. And the guy who put all these pieces together was Elton Mayo, who is now known as the father of the human relations school of thought. And this chart just makes that shift so incredibly clear. On the left, you've got the classical guys: Weber, Taylor, Vail. It's all about productivity, structure, division of labor. Very mechanical. But then look at the right, the neoclassical approach from Elton Mayo. The focus completely flips to things like job satisfaction, morale, and the needs of the individual. The whole conversation changed from an engineering problem to a human one. But the story doesn't stop there. Even this new way of thinking started to evolve. The early human relations approach, on the left, was great, but a little simplistic. It was mostly just about informal groups and the idea that a happy worker is a productive worker. The next stage, what we call the behavioral science approach, got a lot more rigorous. It started using actual scientific methods from psychology and sociology to really understand the deep complexities of human behavior, group dynamics, and leadership. It even saw conflict, not as something to be stamped out, but as something that could actually be healthy and spark innovation. So, we've gone from seeing an organization as a machine to seeing it as a social group. The modern approaches, which really started taking shape in the 1950s, basically tried to blend these two ideas together. The thinking was, you can't just look at the structure, and you can't just look at the people. You've got to look at everything, all at once, as a whole system. And the first of these big modern theories is the systems approach. This asks us to stop looking at a company as a bunch of separate boxes on a chart. Sales over here, marketing over there. Instead, we need to see it as one single unified system. The really important words here are interrelated parts. It's like a living organism. What happens in the marketing department absolutely affects what happens in production, which affects sales, and so on. It's all connected. Now, a huge concept here is the idea of an open system. The classical guys saw organizations as these closed-off, self-contained boxes. But the systems view says, no way. An organization is constantly interacting with the world around it. It takes in inputs, things like raw materials, money, information, people. It then goes through a transformation process to create outputs, the products or services it sells. And here's the crucial part. It gets feedback from that environment, which allows it to adapt, change, and hopefully survive. So, to quickly recap this systems thinking, everything inside the organization is connected. All the little subsystems depend on each other. The whole organization is an open system, constantly in a give and take with its environment. And the biggest insight of all is that managers have to focus on the whole, because the whole is always something more than just the sum of its individual parts. And that brings us to our final stop, and honestly, maybe the most practical management theory of them all. After decades of smart people searching for that one perfect, universal, best way to manage, a totally new idea started to emerge. What if there isn't one? This one quote is the absolute heart of what's called the contingency or situational approach. It's a simple idea, but it's a profound rejection of pretty much everything that came before it. The basic logic is that how you run an organization on the inside has to match what's happening on the outside. The best way to manage? It all depends on the situation. Yeah, this comparison really nails the difference. The old classical view was searching for universal truths, like the 10 commandments of management, that you could apply anywhere, anytime. The contingency view just tosses that whole idea out the window. It says that being a good manager isn't about memorizing a rule book. It's about being a good diagnostician. You have to figure out what's needed for this specific problem with these specific people at this specific time. At the end of the day, this means modern management is really about being adaptable. You have to analyze the environment you're in, the task that needs to get done, and the people you're working with. I mean, the kind of loose, creative leadership style that works wonders at a tech startup would be an absolute catastrophe at a nuclear power plant, right? The big lesson from the contingency approach is be flexible and always, always choose the right tool for the job. All right, let's jump right in. Today we're talking about management theory. And I know, the word theory can sound a little, well, boring, right? Super academic, maybe a bit dry. But what if I told you to forget the dusty old rule books? Instead, I want you to picture a massive toolbox, like one a master craftsman would have. It's packed with all sorts of specialized tools collected over 100 years. Each one is perfect for a very specific job, a specific problem. That's what management theory really is. It's a toolbox for leaders. So let's kick things off with a simple question to get our heads in the game. Imagine a car factory, say back in the 1950s. Everything's predictable, right? The assembly line is humming, the tasks are the same day in, day out, and the big goal is just pure, raw efficiency. Now let's fast forward to today. Picture a chaotic tech startup, just a handful of people trying to create something the world has never seen before. The environment is totally unpredictable, goals change every single week, and the only thing that matters is innovating fast. So, here's the question. Would you manage those two places the exact same way? The answer is, well, it's a big no way, right? And believe it or not, that gut feeling, that simple of course not, is the master key to this whole toolbox we're about to open. And that leads us straight to the first major idea we've got to bust wide open, the myth of the one-size-fits-all solution in management. For ages, people were obsessed with finding that one single perfect way to manage, that magic bullet, right? The secret recipe that would work for any company, anywhere, anytime. But as we just figured out, reality is way messier than that. It turns out that whole search for a universal solution, it was a complete dead end. Okay, so if one size fits all is out, then what's in? Well, the answer is something called the contingency approach. Now, I know that sounds like a $50 term from a textbook, but I promise the idea behind it is incredibly simple. All it really means is that the best management action is contingent on the situation. In other words, it depends. There's no single best way to lead or to organize your team. The right move, the best way, changes completely based on the specific context you're dealing with. The cool thing about the contingency approach is that it gives us this really practical if-then way of thinking. Here's how it works. The F part is all about diagnosis. You have to look at your situation and ask the right questions. If my market is stable and predictable, if my team is made up of experienced pros, if the technology we're using is brand new. See, you're sizing up the environment. Then you go to your toolbox and pick the right tool. Then I'll use this leadership style. Then I'll structure my team this way. The absolute core skill of a great manager is getting that if part right, so you can choose the most powerful then. All right, so if we're going to be master managers, we need to actually fill up this toolbox, right? So let's start at the very beginning with the foundational tools. We're talking about the classical theories. Now, you got to remember where these ideas came from. This was the Industrial Revolution. Factories were popping up everywhere. Things were getting huge and complicated. And there was this desperate need for order, for efficiency. So these are the tools you reach for when the job is all about creating stability, making things predictable, and squeezing out every last drop of productivity. First up in our toolbox is a big one. It comes from a guy named Frederick Winslow Taylor, often called the father of scientific management. Now, Taylor was an engineer through and through, and he saw the world of work like an engineering problem. He was convinced that for any task, no matter how small, there was one best way to do it. And how do you find that one best way? Through science. We're talking time and motion studies, standardizing every tool, basically analyzing every tiny little movement. His focus was completely bottom up. He was looking at the individual worker on the shop floor, trying to optimize every single action for pure maximum efficiency. Okay, so while Taylor was looking at the factory floor with a microscope, another pioneer, Henri Fayol, was looking at the whole company through a telescope. Fayol was a big-shot CEO over in France, so his point of view was completely different. He wasn't worried about how fast a worker could shovel coal. He was worried about the entire organization. He came up with what we call administrative management, which is a total top-down view. He was the one who first laid out the core functions of a manager, planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. He was basically writing the playbook for how to run the whole show from the corner office. So you can see the difference between these two guys is just night and day. Taylor, he's all bottom up, totally obsessed with the individual worker's productivity. Fayol, he's all top down, thinking about how to manage the entire company. And here's a really interesting part. While Taylor's methods could be pretty, mechanical, Fayol actually talked about the human side of things. He brought up concepts like encouraging initiative and building team spirit, what he called esprit de corps. They were both trying to solve the puzzle of management, but they were starting from completely opposite corners of the board. Okay, our third classical tool comes from a German sociologist named Max Weber, and he gave us a word that, well, most of us don't love today: bureaucracy. Right? When you hear that word, you think of endless paperwork, red tape, slow-moving government offices. But here's the thing. For Weber, bureaucracy was actually the ideal way to run a large organization. He saw it as the most rational and efficient system possible. And the logic kind of makes sense when you break it down. You divide up the work, you have a clear hierarchy, there are formal rules so everyone is treated the same, and promotions are based on skill, not on who you know. So think of it this way. When you need something to be super consistent, fair, and scalable, bureaucracy is an incredibly powerful tool. But the flip side is that when you need to be fast and flexible, that same structure can feel like a cage. So there we have it, our first set of tools: Taylor's stopwatch for efficiency, Fayol's top-down principles, and Weber's organizational chart for stability. And look, these are amazing tools for a stable, predictable IF. But what happens when the IF gets totally flipped on its head? What happens when the world gets chaotic, when competition comes from everywhere, and when the customer suddenly has all the power? Well, you're going to need a whole new set of tools. And that brings us to this next quote, which is honestly one of the most powerful in modern management history. It's the definition of something called business process reengineering, or BPR, and I want you to really zero in on the words they chose: fundamental, radical, dramatic. This is not, I repeat, not about making small, safe improvements. This is not about tweaking what you already do. BPR is about grabbing a blank sheet of paper and asking a terrifyingly simple question. If we were building this company from scratch today, knowing what we know now, how would we do this? It's about obliteration and reinvention. But okay, that sounds pretty intense. Does this radical redesign stuff actually work in the real world? Oh, you better believe it. Let's look at the classic example: IBM's credit division back in the 80s. See, to get a credit request approved, the paperwork had to go through this long chain of specialists. It was like a slow-motion assembly line. And the whole thing took, on average, 7 weeks. So what did they do? They re-engineered it. They got rid of the assembly line and created a single case manager role. One person, armed with the right tech, who could handle almost the entire process from start to finish. And the result? They took that 7-week process and crushed it down to 90 minutes. That is what dramatic looks like. And it's important to note that BPR comes in a few different flavors, depending on how ambitious you want to be. You could say there are 3 levels. At type 1, you're basically fixing what's broken, improving a process, cutting some costs. It's good stuff. At type 2, you're getting more competitive. You're looking at the best companies out there and saying, we want to be that good. But then there's type 3. This is the big one. Here, you're not just trying to get better at the existing game, you're trying to create a break point, an innovation so profound that you completely rewrite the rules for everybody in your industry. Okay, our next tool in the modern toolbox tackles a totally different, but maybe even more important problem. How in the world do you survive when the world around you is changing at lightning speed? Well, according to thinkers like Peter Senge, the answer is you have to become a learning organization. And let's be super clear, this has nothing to do with just sending people to a training course once a year. No, this is about building a company that is just naturally, fundamentally good at creating new knowledge, spreading that knowledge around, and then actually using it to change and adapt. It's about making learning your superpower. And making this happen, wow, it's a huge cultural shift. Just think about the differences. In a traditional company, the vision comes from the top floor and gets handed down. In a learning organization, it's a shared vision that everybody has a hand in creating. In a traditional place, you focus on your little piece of the puzzle. Here, everyone understands the whole picture and how their piece fits. Even the way you handle disagreements changes. It's not about who's higher up the ladder, it's about learning from each other's perspectives to find the best solution. It is a fundamentally different way of operating. So pretty much every tool we've talked about so far has been about how to operate more effectively inside a market that already exists. But what if there was a tool that could help you see a massive market that almost everyone else was completely blind to? A concept that could totally change your definition of who a customer even is and open up incredible new avenues for growth? Well, buckle up, because that's exactly what we're looking at next. 4 billion. Just let that number sink in for a second. 4 billion people. That's over half a planet. And for decades, the biggest, smartest corporations in the world looked at this huge chunk of humanity and they saw absolutely nothing. They didn't see customers, they didn't see a market, they saw a problem to be solved by charities, maybe. But then one brilliant thinker, C.K. Prahalad, looked at those same 4 billion people and he saw the future of business. So this is the World Economic Pyramid. Now, for as long as anyone can remember, Big global companies have been fighting tooth and nail over that tiny little sliver at the very top, Tier 1. We're talking maybe 100 million wealthy consumers. But just look down. Look at the base, Tier 4. People earning less than $1,500 a year. That's where you find those 4 billion people. And here was Prahalad's revolutionary idea. This bottom of the pyramid isn't a group to be pitied or given handouts. It is a massive, untapped and vibrant market waiting for businesses smart enough to create brand new models to serve them. And please, don't think this is just some nice academic theory. This is a battle-tested, proven strategy. A perfect example is Hindustan Unilever in India. For years, they just sold their normal products to wealthy people in the cities. But then a small local company came out with a super cheap detergent and started winning over the huge rural market. HUL realized their old way of doing things just wouldn't work, so they had to innovate. They created a totally new product, wheel detergent, specifically designed for people who wash clothes by hand in rivers. They changed their entire production and distribution model. They made it incredibly affordable. They built a business from the ground up to serve the bottom of the pyramid, and it became one of their biggest success stories. Wow, okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? We've gone all the way from the smoky factories of the Industrial Revolution right to the cutting edge of the global marketplace. We've seen tools for creating rigid efficiency, tools for blowing things up and starting over, tools for continuous learning, and even tools for seeing markets where no one else could. So, what's the big takeaway here? How do we tie all of this together? And that brings us right back to where we started, to the main point of all this. A truly great manager isn't just an expert with a hammer who sees every problem as a nail. They're not the person who thinks BPR is the solution to everything or that bureaucracy is always bad. No, a great manager is that master craftsperson. They know every single tool in their box, inside and out. And more importantly, they have the wisdom to look at any situation, to diagnose the if, and know with confidence exactly which tool or which combination of tools is right for the job. They've mastered the then. They have mastered the contingency approach. But you know, that toolbox is never finished. The work is never done. The world just keeps on changing, and with it, new challenges pop up all the time. 100 years ago, the big problem was figuring out how to run a factory efficiently. Today, the challenges are things like managing teams scattered all across the globe, figuring out how to work with artificial intelligence, and keeping a creative spark alive when half your team is working from their living room. So I want to leave you with a question to chew on. In this new world we're building, what's the next tool a master manager is going to need? What's the next great idea that belongs in the toolbox?